Welcome to the deep dive. You've handed us, wow, quite a collection of sources this time. We're looking at recent discussions touching on neuroscience, AI, computation, biology, even the process of science itself.
It's definitely a broad sweep, but what's fascinating and what these sources really highlight is how interconnected these fields are becoming. They're not really separate silos anymore.
Absolutely. So, our mission today is to unpack all of this. We want to pull out the most compelling ideas, the real nuggets, and explore those surprising links between what might seem like very different areas.
Think of it as a guided tour, maybe?
Exactly. A guided tour through some cutting-edge thinking. We'll try to help you get a handle on these complex topics without hopefully feeling too overwhelmed by the jargon. Okay, let's get into it.
Let's do it. And, right off the bat, the sources jump into a challenge that sounds simple, but it's actually fundamental.
Ah, you mean the definitions. The struggle to pin down what we actually mean by some key terms.
Precisely. Take mechanism in neuroscience.
Yeah.
One source calls it a suitcase word.
A suitcase word, I like that. It reminds me of Marvin Minsky talking about words like emotion or intelligence.
Yeah.
They seem like one thing on the outside, but when you unpack them, it's messy. Lots of different stuff crammed in there.
Exactly. And that's the danger, right? If you
Yeah.
don't unpack it, you gloss over the real complexity. So within mechanism, you've got quite different concepts jostling together.
Like what?
Well, they're what they call causal mechanisms.
Mm.
That's often about intervention. It's like silencing a specific brain area, maybe part of the parietal lobe or frontal cortex.
And then seeing what happens, what changes elsewhere in the network or in behavior.
Right. Direct cause and effect. You poke the system here and see the result there. It's sort of intuitive, like a simple machine.
Okay. But that's not the only kind.
No. Then you have what they term emerging mechanisms. Think about how, say, kidney organoids develop from precursor cells, or how bacteria create these intricate branching patterns guided by something like Turing patterns.
Those self-organizing chemical signals.
Yeah, or even building things like xenobots or anthropods from cultured cells. These aren't about tweaking an existing system. It's about complex structure and function emerging, seemingly on its own, from simpler parts organizing themselves.
Wow. So the same word mechanism covers both flipping a specific switch in the brain and the spontaneous growth of a complex biological form.
That's the ambiguity they're pointing to. It's just like Minsky's point about intelligence trying to use one word to cover such different phenomena causes problems.
And why does this matter for you listening? Well, if the language scientists use isn't clear, it just makes everything harder. Sharing understanding, replicating results, building on each other's work.
Yeah, cumulative progress becomes a real challenge. It hampers our ability to connect findings from, say, a brain stimulation study with one on developmental biology, even if they both use the word mechanism.
And this definitional fuzziness, it feeds right into the whole debate around intelligence too, doesn't it?
Absolutely. The sources highlight that ongoing struggle. What is intelligence, really? Especially when we compare AI and natural systems. Maybe we actually need different definitions for different contexts.
Okay, so getting the language right is a serious hurdle. But moving past that challenge, the sources then really dive into how computation is giving us new tools to actually model these complex systems, even with fuzzy definitions.
Right. This is where you really see the bridge between biology and computation being built. They talk about using graph neural networks, GNNs.
GNNs.
Yeah, applying them to understand how neural systems develop. Specifically, they mention work in C. elegans, the little nematode worm.
So simulating how its nervous system gets wired up as it grows, cell by cell.
Pretty much. They use dynamic GNNs. Nodes representing the cells are added over time as cells divide. The timing of these divisions, these births, is crucial.
And how do they know where the new cells should go?
Well, that's where algorithms come in. Things like CMAES. It's a type of evolutionary algorithm. It sort of learns the best spatial relationships, placing the daughter cells correctly relative to others.
So it's not just mapping, it's computationally growing a virtual nervous system.
Exactly. A dynamic spatial model.
Yeah.
And the sources cover modeling brain morphogenesis too. How the whole brain gets its physical shape at a molecular level.
What's the key takeaway there?
What's really fascinating is finding these deeply conserved molecular toolkits across incredibly different species, mammals, birds, reptiles, fish.
Even though their adult brains can look vastly different, like some don't even have a cerebellum, right?
Precisely. It suggests there's a fundamental set of molecular building blocks, but how they're used, the timing and combination, leads to all that diversity we see.
Amazing.
They also touch on how neuronal projections develop how nerves grow to find their targets. The classic example is the retinotectal projection, from the eye to the brain.
The growth cones.
Yeah, the axonal growth cones acting like little explorers, sensing their environment, interacting with the target tissue, guided by chemical cues. It's incredibly intricate.
And this computational modeling approach, it's not just for studying natural development,
No, definitely not. The sources bring in synthetic biology and organoids too.
like the kidney organoids you mentioned.
Yes, and work on things like Gli3-KO organoids, where they knock out a specific gene, Gli3-3, to see its effect on development. There's even this really cool, slightly sci-fi idea of engineering E. coli bacteria to produce the specific growth factors you need to culture organoids in the lab.
Wow, using bacteria as tiny factories for organoid food. And then there's the dish brain example that got a lot of attention.
Ah, yes, the brain organoid that supposedly learned to play a version of Pong. Provocative stuff. It really pushes the boundary between living tissue and computational interaction.
So all this feeds into bio-inspired AI, embodied agents.
Exactly. Trying to build computational systems that work more like biological ones, or systems that learn and act within a physical or simulated body or environment. The sources sort of group this under headings like cultural computational modeling or growth in form. It shows how computation isn't just for analysis anymore. It's for simulation, prediction, even construction.
Okay, so shifting gears slightly, but staying with computation. The sources obviously dive deep into AI itself, large language models, LLMs, and these incredible advances in simulating entire worlds.
Yeah, the progress there is just staggering. They mention models like Llama, Phi, and the efforts to get surprisingly powerful, smaller versions running on really limited hardware, like a Raspberry Pi, which is 4 gigs of RAM.
That's wild and useful for specific things, right? Like querying huge databases or documentation much faster than digging through manually.
Definitely, but it's going way beyond just information retrieval. The sources cite evidence suggesting these models might actually be surpassing humans on certain creative tasks, things like divergent thinking, finding unusual associations, even creative writing.
Which again forces you to ask, what is creativity? When a machine does it, is it genuine insight or just incredibly sophisticated pattern matching? It's that suitcase word problem again, but for creativity.
It really is. And then you get to this mind-bending concept of world models, using AI not just to understand language,
Yeah.
but to simulate entire interactive environments.
The Game Engine Gen platform sounds like something out of science fiction, using Stable Diffusion, an image generation model, to simulate the game Doom in real time.
Yes, and not just showing pictures. The model apparently simulates the actual game state. It understands object interactions, opening doors, shooting enemies, picking up items, and maintains consistency over long sequences of actions. And the visual quality is close to the original game.
That feels like a paradigm shift, a completely new way to think about building game engines or any kind of interactive simulation.
It certainly points in that direction. And it's not just about games. The sources also bring up Numenta's Thousand Brains project.
Right, their open source effort based on how they think the neocortex works.
Exactly. They're aiming for a fundamentally different kind of AI, arguing that true intelligence needs to be grounded in the principles of the brain, specifically their theory about reference frames and how the cortex builds models of the world.
So very different from the standard deep learning approach.
That's the idea. What's
Yeah.
powerful here is seeing AI evolve from a data analysis tool to something capable of generating dynamic, interactive realities and even inspiring new computational architectures based on biology.
But handling all this complex data, whether from simulations or biological experiments, requires some serious mathematical muscle, right? The sources emphasize we need to go beyond basic geometry.
Yeah, that's a key point. A lot of the data we're talking about doesn't fit neatly into standard Euclidean space.
Yeah.
The flat grid-like space we're used to.
You mean data with weird shapes, curvature, complex connections, hierarchies.
Exactly. Think about, say, the curvature of space-time in physics, or the intricate network of connections between neurons, or physical symmetries in molecular structures, or even representing developing embryos as point clouds. Sometimes hyperbolic geometry, a curved space, actually captures the relationships much better.
So just using standard distances and statistics can miss the point or even mislead you.
It can, yeah. You need a broader mathematical toolkit. Understanding the geometry, the topology, the algebraic structure of the data itself is crucial.
Makes sense. The sources also bring up criticality theory in the brain.
Right. This is the idea that Brain networks might naturally tune themselves to operate near a critical point, like a phase transition.
Kind of balanced on the edge between order and chaos.
Sort of, yeah, balancing excitation and inhibition. The hypothesis is that this critical regime makes the brain more adaptable, more efficient at processing information, allowing it to flexibly switch between different states needed for thinking. And they're using real data, MEG brain scans, tractography mapping the wiring to test these ideas.
And practically speaking, how do researchers even represent all this diverse data?
Well, there are lots of ways. You might have connectivity matrices showing who's connected to whom in the brain. You can model those as complex graphs using tools like Network X. Or you might use semantic graphs like RDF to capture relationships and meaning.
Plus all the other types, time series, molecular sequences.
Exactly. And crucially, you need good metadata, often stored in formats like JSON, to describe what the data is, where it came from, the units, how it connects to the concepts. Flexibility is key.
The sources also briefly mentioned alternative computing ideas, mem computing.
Yeah, just a nod towards non-standard approaches. Things like using self-organizing logic gates, maybe based on Ising models from physics, or coupled oscillators. The idea is to build physical systems that can solve certain hard problems, like combinatorial optimization, by naturally settling into a low-energy state that represents the answer.
And finally, in this section, they touched on credit assignment.
Ah, yes. That's a huge puzzle in neuroscience. How does your brain figure out which specific neurons or synapses were responsible when you learn something successfully or make a good decision? How does it assign credit or blame?
It sounds fundamental to learning.
It absolutely is. And linking the theories about how this might work to actual experimental data is a major ongoing challenge. It really underscores how much we still have to figure out about basic brain function.
Okay, let's zoom out a bit. Beyond the hardcore science and math, the sources also give us a really interesting perspective on the research ecosystem itself. You know, the human side of things, the tools, the processes.
Yeah, there's a big emphasis on the push towards open science. That means not just sharing papers, but building the actual infrastructure needed tools for annotating data, platforms for making data and code openly available.
And recognizing the people who build that infrastructure, the research engineers. Sustaining open source software in science is a real challenge they discuss too.
And related to openness, there's a fascinating discussion about rethinking peer review.
Going beyond just the pre-publication gatekeeping.
Exactly. They float this idea of peer validation, where maybe years after a paper is published, with the data and code available, other researchers rigorously try to replicate and validate the findings.
And that validation work itself would be seen as a valuable scientific contribution, not just repeating something.
That's the proposal, making validation a core, incentivized part of the scientific process. Some journals are already experimenting, like publishing reviewer comments and author responses alongside the paper. It adds transparency.
It feels like a necessary step, especially with complex computational work.
For sure. And speaking of scale, the sources highlight these massive neuroscience data projects. Things like the Human Connectome Project, Data Joint, Neurodata Without Borders, the Virtual Brain Project.
Huge undertakings, often involving collaborations between national labs, universities, private companies, open source efforts.
Right. They also mentioned specific homes and meetings, like the Big Brain Highball Conference at McGill or the Global Brain Consortium focusing on imaging and EEG history. It paints a picture of a really interconnected global effort.
But reproducibility is still a concern, right? They mention issues, like in organoid research.
Yes, it's an ongoing challenge, which again highlights why these open data and validation efforts are so important. They need to become more common practice.
And what about the people doing the research? Mentoring, training.
That comes through too. The importance of good lab mentoring, but also peer mentoring, maybe helping colleagues write papers and structured programs like Google Summer of Code or specific studentships.
They also made a nice point about the value of just organizing data.
Yeah, taking existing data sets and putting them into standard formats like JSON with clear metadata so other people can actually find and use them easily. That kind of careful data curation is a huge, often unsung contribution.
The sources also briefly touched on philosophy and ethics.
Slightly. Framing data not as some objective truth, but as something generated through our interaction with computational tools and shaped by the choices we make about which models or methods to use. And then computational psychiatry came up.
Using AI for mental health.
Yes, things like helping with dementia diagnosis or trying to find data-driven subtypes, biotypes of conditions like depression or anxiety based on brain circuits. even modeling concepts like psychiatric contagion.
So, as we pull all these threads together, it really feels like the sources are urging us to look at these complex systems, the brain, AI, developing organisms from many different angles.
Definitely. Adopting different vantage points, as one source put it. Maybe stepping outside our usual human-centric biases, our focus on purpose, social meaning roles might be necessary to truly understand some of these systems.
Which circles back in a way to that classic cybernetics paper they mentioned, Rosenbluth, Wiener, Bigelow on purpose.
It's exactly. Their 1943 paper explored how feedback loops could generate behavior that looks purposeful without needing some mysterious internal goal setter. They pointed out that cybernetic systems are inherently predictive, extrapolative.
So, is the complex adaptive behavior we see in biology, or maybe even AI, genuine purpose? Or is it just incredibly sophisticated layers of feedback control aiming for certain states?
That's the deep question, isn't it? And it connects to that nature is computation idea as well.
Which doesn't necessarily mean the universe is a computer.
Right, but more that computational thinking, finding analogies between natural processes like evolution or development and engineered computational systems can be incredibly powerful. The models might capture similar dynamics, similar emergent behavior, even if the underlying stuff is different.
Like that VITA simulation looks alive, evolves, but it's just code.
Yeah. These abstract or computational models give us different lenses, different tools for thought to try and grasp the complex realities these sources lay out, from the slipperiness of words like mechanism to the intricate dance of molecules, neurons, and algorithms.
Okay, so quite a journey. We've gone from the basic but tricky definitions of concepts like mechanism and intelligence through the really cutting-edge ways computation is modeling and mimicking biology. We've touched on the sophisticated math needed for complex data, and even considered the human infrastructure and processes behind the science.
Yeah, and what stands out, I think, is just how interconnected it all is. Understanding brain principles informs AI design. Computational tools let us see biological structures in new ways. And the scientific method itself is being reshaped by the demands of open data and reproducibility.
This deep dive really shows a research landscape buzzing with activity, pushing boundaries everywhere, and crucially, those pushes are influencing each other.
It highlights both the big, fundamental questions we still face, like defining our core concepts, and the amazing ingenuity being applied, especially from the computational side, to model, simulate, and make sense of it all.
So, given everything we've discussed, the rapid progress in AI simulation, being able to recreate complex worlds like Doom, and our increasing ability to computationally model intricate biological systems, here's a final thought for you to chew on.
Uh,
If we're getting this good at simulating complex realities, both digital and biological, what does that really imply about the nature of our reality and about the ultimate power and maybe the limits of computation to truly understand or perhaps even replicate the world around us?
that definitely blurs some lines. A lot
Yeah.
to think about there.